say that you're appropriately dressed for today's show.
All right.
Yeah, little known show that I know you had to be a big fan of, starring James Garner. He drove a Camaro. He lived in a trailer with his older father.
Oh, the Rockford Files? Oh, my word.
Yeah, well, no, you're saying it wrong. It's Rockefeller Files, and that's what I want to talk to you about.
No.
If you can picture NAR wearing the cowboy hat, and you're the older father, or maybe it's not.
Don't. Jeez, that's painful.
Well, no, but think about it. Rockford lives in a trailer. The Rockefellers are storing national documents in a barn. It's 601. It really deserves to be a primetime special in the 1970s. Starring an irascible old man who always criticizes Rockefeller. What are you doing out there in the barn all the time? You should get a real, pouring over those files.
A 60-minute spot on CBS with Mike Wallace. What are the Rockefellers doing with all of these documents in the barn?
Exactly. Tonight on Rockefeller Files, he finally discovers the file on the alien DNA, and we got to get out a red magic marker for this one. I wanted to ask you about this, Dr. Farrell, because I'm fascinated and confused, as one might understand when you hear that top secret government documents are kept in a barn. It's not Cambodia. I don't know what we're doing, but we've got places for this stuff,
Yeah, we do.
Some of your listeners have more secure vaults underneath their very feet than I think were in that barn. We know some of you and where you're keeping the sea rations too. It's part of why we have membership. It's our tracking system. But no, I wanted to ask, because the little piece that you quoted and talked about this week, a couple of things went through my head as you might conclude. One is, wow, I wonder what was in there. The alien DNA files, the Roswell, the Kennedy assassination files, the Vietnam, why we were really in Vietnam files. What is this? That Hitler's still alive in Argentina and singing in the opera files. What's happening? But he's still got his voice, Doctor. He's still got his voice.
He's singing Siegfried.
Yeah, you get the Ring of Nibelung, and he does quite it's not polished, but it is a spectacle. The audience stands on their feet, and it's not even over. He's right. But anyway, I got to thinking, what's in those files? And I got to thinking also, the point that you made about sort of this nexus between potentially the financial and the intelligent establishment, which is certainly an outstanding feature of the current administration, if nothing else. We have
all of them.
Amazing array of Wall Street bankers and financial types.
Goldman Sachs. Yep.
I mean,
Sullivan and Cromwell.
For those who bought that story of it's going to be, not that way. We've got a stack of resumes.
It could be worse under Hillary Clinton. That's all I'm going to say, Dan.
Well,
let's not go there.
A straw man, but we've got a stack of resumes for you. We're keeping them in a vault in Dr. Farrell's barn, and we want you to take a look at some of the backgrounds of these guys. My point is, though, in looking at the document that you cited, and when you click through the link of the article, where they did the scan of the vault to see if it was reasonably, the language basically says, can we get away with putting documents in there? It's really out of the ordinary, and this isn't desirable at all, but does it pass the minimum requirement, right? And that's got the name on it of Robert Gambino, who is at that time, I think it's director of security for the CIA. And which also made me think of the Gambino family. I'm sure there's no relationship. But what's interesting about Gambino, though, is in 1977, he has a rather well-known briefing where he briefs Jeb Bush. And Jeb writes a letter thanking him for an extremely thorough intelligence briefing. And in 1980, Jeb Bush joins his father's campaign, and Gambino also becomes a Bush political campaigner and a political appointee until 1994, when he retires as the director of the U.S. Selective Service. Cushy job if there ever was one. Did you register? You didn't register. We got one question here at the Selective Service. It's just like a checkbox. You're in charge of it. They need a director to manage a checkbox. Mm-hmm. But that's a long political relationship, and it sort of underscores this this interesting nexus you're pointing out between financial intelligence establishments, which obviously is old hat in conspiracy circles. But it got me to thinking. And as I was thinking, you know, what does the intelligence apparatus of the United States have to do with providing, you know, rather free access to anytime they want to top secret documents to the financial arm of the country? Mm-hmm. And then I got to thinking about where else are documents being kept. And it just so happens, coincidentally, that today I saw another article. This one not mentioned in your blog, and this one is from sciencemag.org. And I'm going to read a quote from it, and then I'll ask my question. So the quote is this: "A nuclear weapons physicist embarked on a 5-year quest to recover and salvage an estimated 10,000 films."
Uh-oh, we're breaking up. Uh-oh, you froze. You there? It froze.
California, which is operated by the DOE, has scanned a bunch of these films, blah, blah, blah. A lot of them have been posted, declassified, and posted on YouTube. And researchers are trying to preserve the film before it's lost forever. They're also correcting and updating a bunch of old figures, some of which were off by about 30%. So what stuck out to me is, okay, so there's this important nuclear weapons stuff that is, quote, scattered across the country in secure vaults. Mm-hmm. And because it's nuclear weapons testing stuff, I got to thinking about it. Why would you diversify a bunch of stuff across the US? Well, in network technology, I'm using Amazon Web Services to store a bunch of files. Why do I do that? Because they have multiple data centers. So if one of them gets hit by a nuclear weapon or something, if Texas goes down, well, New York's online, Virginia's online. The data is going to be redundantly backed up and safe. And this is standard military strategy. It's used in military planes and now commercial aircraft. We have double and triple redundancy. So what's the old-fashioned pre-digital version of redundancy of data? Well, it would be to squirrel this stuff away in different places in the country so you could recover potentially from a nuclear disaster. So my questions to you are twofold. Number one, do you think that potentially one reason the financial apparatus could have been entrusted with documents like that, we don't know what those documents contain, but like the ones in the barn, could be as a redundancy system in case of disaster? Because if you remember the 70s, we were afraid and we built bunkers. Right. And number two, what kinds of documents do you think would have needed to be protected if such a scenario were the case? Would you protect videos of nuclear tests, or what would you protect? What would be the high value documents you'd need to spread out? Or is this smoke and crack and that wouldn't be the purpose?
Well, excuse me. As far as the redundancy issue and physical redundancy for documents, my problem with the whole Rockefeller story, and I'm going to go to David Robert Steele here for a moment, a former CIA case officer. And again, in choosing Steele, I want to caution people, I am not in favor of Steele's idea that we need a constitutional convention. It's much better to observe the Constitution we have, which we're not doing, than to throw the whole thing open to another Philadelphia-style convention and end up with something even worse than we have now. I'm with Catherine Fitz on this regard, that a constitutional convention would be a way for the high financial powers to walk away from all the debt and leave the debt saddles on the federal government and have them be able to walk away from all their obligations. But Steele has pointed out that the CIA, that there is no one CIA. The CIA is about 7 factions. And one of the factions that he explicitly mentions as being a faction within the CIA is the Wall Street financial, and he even goes so far as to say the Sullivan and Cromwell group. So, in other words, I'm with him in that regard because I've always regarded the CIA as having been the creation of Wall Street. After all, its first director for many years was Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles was a partner of Sullivan and Cromwell. We know about his career in all of its murky, disturbing detail. So it's not surprising to me that the Rockefellers would have documents from the CIA. I pointed out something in the Secret Space Program conference in 2014 that the Rockefeller family actually itself helped privately fund the backup camera systems for the Corona spy satellites, which were, uber top secret at the time. So in other words, the Rockefellers had bought essentially a channel directly into the CIA, directly into the National Reconnaissance Office, and so on. I'm not surprised about that. So let's go to the physical redundancy question. I would doubt that the Rockefeller family would have documents stored for the purposes of physical redundancy. The reason I doubt that is I've always strongly suspected that if you're the Soviet Union and you've got massive amounts of redundant overkill bombardment capability of the continental United States, one of the places you would target and one of the centers of financial power and communications would be every Rockefeller institution, including their home in Poconoco. So in other words, David Rockefeller was probably on the Soviet target list. So I don't think that this was physical redundancy. But as for what kind of documents I would store, the documents would be, to my mind, primarily of a nature that would indicate the extent of the American human intelligence networks around the world, the contacts, the drops, and so on. If you were to suffer a catastrophic attack or event of another sort on American military and intelligence resources in a war, you would want backup of those types of files around the country that would have protocols for access to them. That's the kind of documents I think you'd store, including chain of command protocols and so on in the military and all of that stuff. The Rockefeller family, as to what those documents were, I strongly suspect that they were of a nature dealing with financial intelligence, that they were probably UFO files. You kind of joked about that, but Lawrence and Nelson Rockefeller particularly had an interest in the UFO subject, so they might have those types of files there in that barn. I'm not surprised about the whole story. I really am not. It just confirms that the Central Intelligence Agency is not an agency of the federal government as much as it is an agency of Wall Street, kind of hiding behind the federal government. I think it was David Talbot in his book about Allen Dulles recently, brings this whole aspect of the connection to Wall Street, Sullivan and Cromwell, that whole outfit, into very, very stark relief, and he does a very good job of it. So I'm not surprised.
Well, we'll provide a link to the declassified documents about this in the members section. But it strikes me, Dr. Farrell. Of course, Rockefeller is former vice president of the United States at this time.
Yeah.
And it strikes me, isn't this a crime? I mean, didn't we just get through going through
it is a crime.
A whole fiasco about the Clinton email servers,
Right.
much less egregious than just, yeah, we got a vault in our barn full of top secret documents I had brought over from my days as the VP. That would seem like that's a huge violation. That, I mean,
It is.
is nobody going to now go after Mrs. Rockefeller or the Rockefeller family or the Rockefeller Foundation? And I mean,
Well, they need to, but you know, they need to do that. They need to go after Hillary. They need to go after Bill. They need to clean out this whole cesspool. But the problem, you know, this is the problem that we're facing. No one is obeying the Constitution. No one is prosecuting, you know, under the rule of law that we have. And you're right. I think it's a very egregious violation of protocol unless this is part of some hitherto unknown program, as you say, of trying to disperse documents. If that's the case, then we're faced with another question. Who authorized that program and under what statute did they do so? And to my knowledge, Daniel, I don't know of any such protocol. I think you're correct. I think it's an egregious violation, and they need to figure out why. And the other thing that is implicated in this, they need to figure out, well, did the Rockefeller family make copies of this document cache? Did they disseminate it to their various institutions, family members, and so on? In other words, how deeply does this really go? And again, I don't think that they're prepared to go there simply because this would expose the whole nexus between the Wall Street financial legal community and the CIA, and expose the CIA for what it has always been. And that is, to a certain extent, it's always been an agency gathering intelligence, not for the federal government, but for Wall Street. This is very, very clear. It's very clear that when the CIA was set up, you had an enormous influence of Sullivan and Cromwell on the way the National Security Act of 1947 was actually written. So, you know, this is something that needs to come out, and it needs to be exposed, and it needs to be fixed.
well, I shudder to think what's in a hall closet down in Mar-a-Lago, but you know, that's another topic. I want to ask you about another issue, which is about sort of ancient government and politics. So in ancient Mesoamerica, a new sort of study has been published, not in ancient Mesoamerica, but about it.
Right.
And the assertion of this study is that we tend to view ancient societies outside of Europe, or specifically outside of Greece and Rome, or at least Greece and the Mediterranean, as totalitarian. We tend to think of democracy as having been born among the Europeans, or at least among the Greeks, and then adopted as a European model. And there's certainly a lot of evidence that totalitarianism is popular among European men as well. But a lot of the sites they've dug up in ancient Mesoamerica don't fit the narrative. And so they dig up sites where there's a large sort of central palace, everything around it's a shack, and there are giant heads of the king and queen all over the place, and apparently useless monuments that keep people sort of engaged building these things. But essentially there's one family that lives in wealth and everybody else lives in poverty. But they've discovered other ancient cities where there's a Senate, and the Senate is set up outside the city, and they've got historical accounts of what it takes to become a member of the Senate. Apparently you have to go and undergo some brutal tests and trials to be understood to be worthy to represent your people. And so they have sort of a Republican model. And everything else around the town is sort of equivalent. You know, there are houses with patios and other houses with patios, and there's a town square, and you know, the signs are there that this was not a totalitarian government. It's a fairly open society. And so what they've done is they've gone through and they've sort of reevaluated all these sites, and they've said that, you know, all these ancient Mesoamerican sites break down into these two categories of autocracy or collective. Autocracy being totalitarian, and collective being some sort of society where we the people rule, right? And my question to you about that is, one, why would there be an inherent bias? Is it just the obvious thing of being Eurocentric toward anybody else having sort of created the instruments of free society? And then second, do you think that we're thinking of society correctly? Because as being something in which it's essentially bottom up or top down, that it's an autocracy or it's a collective, a bottom up collective. Are those the only categories in which ancient man could have organized himself? Because it seems rather neat.
Well, it's too neat. I don't know about the Eurocentrism. As far as I know, there's some evidence to suggest that some of the founding fathers were aware of the way that the Iroquois Confederacy worked back in the 18th century. The Iroquois had, for what appears to be all intents and purposes, a working kind of federal system that was not autocratic, but by the same token was not a pure democracy. Some of these I've always suspected that with regard to Mesoamerica that you were dealing with societies like that, because even Montezuma was not, although we tend to think of him from our history books as being kind of an autocrat, he really wasn't, because he had to rule with the connivance and with the approval of the priestly class within the Aztec Empire. So it wasn't a strict autocracy in that sense. And that class often was the way, just like it was in medieval Europe, it was the way that people that were not part of the nobility could advance themselves by going into the clergy. So I've never really bought the idea that these societies were totalitarian in the modern sense. But I do agree that I think that there's a problem in our political philosophy that, like you say, we've got totalitarianism on one end and we've got pure democracy on the other, and there's nothing in between. And this goes back to the heart of the problem, as far as I'm concerned, is the problem is we don't need a new constitution. We need to observe the one that we have, and nobody's doing that. And this is my big problem here. The Eurocentrism thing I've never bought into, because these were not stupid people. They were aware of the systems that they were encountering, particularly in this country with some of the Indian tribes. For that matter, I stop and think of growing up in South Dakota, where I had almost daily contact with people that were members of the Lakota Nation. And again, you had a system with the Lakota that resembled much more of a confederacy than it did an autocracy, where the chief is the be all and end all and final say on every political issue that confronted them.
So one of the things I can't help but notice is that these guys are basing the theory with cause, that
Right.
a totalitarian society can be noted through its use of monuments. If there are a lot of apparently enormous monuments that take vast amounts of human labor to produce,
Got to be totalitarian.
well, in some sense, if people don't wake up in the morning and say, instead of making more for my family or building a nicer patio, I'll go work for the next 14 hours on this monument along with
Right.
everybody else. Eventually it becomes a very one-sided thing. So what they're essentially saying is monument-based societies seem to be totalitarian societies, and that we can see that in the relationship of the presence of the monuments and the centrality of the palaces, the disproportionate use of wealth, shacks, not places with patios, surrounding the monuments, meaning you sort of gave up your ambitions for personal wealth, and then also the presence of sort of quasi-religious or religious ritual surrounding these monuments and the king or the emperor or whatever it is. These seem to be the things. And I would just characterize it as a monument-based society is a totalitarian society, and a free society is one that eschews monuments in general. And it's not saying they don't build a nice place for the Senate, but that doesn't build giant skyscrapers that seem to have no modern purpose except to be the 800-foot Jesus in Tulsa, Oklahoma or something. Is that thing still there? Or is it, it's a statue of Oral Roberts, isn't it? Or is
No,
it,
I don't know.
you know what I'm talking about. It used to be on the campus. But
No, you're thinking about the praying hands.
oh yeah, okay. There's a giant
In front of the hospital that he attempted to build there back when I was there. Yeah.
But you know, let's get those hands up. But the question I have for you is sort of weird, but I'm going to explore it. So it's partly a political science question because, you know, you and I have both kicked around this theory of Kantorowicz's in the King's Two Bodies that, you know, a lot of our institutions are much older and come out of, you know, we didn't invent them in America, and they come out of a set of assumptions. But there's some other recent news. So there's this project called Scan Pyramids, and it's run by an Arab nation and what they're doing is taking these muon particle detectors into the pyramids, and they're attempting to locate additional entrances and gaps. And of course, the Egyptian government is saying, well, these guys aren't archaeologists, you know, they're just other scientists, and so you can't trust their conclusions. I find that spurious, but
it is. Totally.
I used radar to detect a fish. Yes, but you're not a fisherman, therefore you don't know that that's not a log. It's like, well, okay, shaped like a fish and it's breathing underwater. I don't know what to tell you, but I got to thinking about this, and they're finding these additional hidden recesses. You know, the only reason you put lots and lots of doors and openings and stuff in a monument like this is if it has a purpose, right? And as I'm thinking about these monuments, I couldn't help but think about the Rockefeller's barn. And it just, I'm going somewhere with this, but
I hope so.
It occurred to me that there's some weird, freaky stuff going on among ancient man. It seems like that wherever you go, there are monuments that are fairly similar all throughout Northumbria, and they just unearthed some more in Scotland, and they're all over Wales, and they're all over Germany and Italy. There are these rocks, and these rocks have these symbols, and these symbols are concentric rings with a gutter proceeding out from the nucleus and exiting the concentric rings.
Right.
Can't help but look at that and just go, look, that's either fertility or that's a solar system map.
Yes.
You know, that looks astoundingly like modern maps of the solar system and so on, and how it sort of works. And I couldn't help but think, you know, all right, so these things are scattered around. They're not secret. But this would be the knowledge of the common man. The common man sort of has these rings and these concentric circles and this notion of thing. But if that's what the common man has, what does the elite in a society have? In a society that's monument driven, where they build these giant monuments, they must have more knowledge, inside knowledge. And what are they going to do if common man is putting that stuff all over just rocks and posts and cave walls? What is elite man doing in these societies with the deeper knowledge that they have? Are they storing it somewhere? And it struck me that if I was ancient man and I really wanted to preserve the knowledge, I'm not saying they do, I would want to do a couple of things. One, I would want to store it in some kind of impregnable or lasting place that I knew lasted longer than a shack of a guy that just built my palace. And secondly, I'm not just going to put it in his barn. And second, I'm going to check it out and see if it meets the minimum standard for, the Rockefellers or something. And then secondly, I'm going to distribute that in a redundant way throughout multiple locations. I'm going to have sites where if it's here and this one gets taken over by the Mycenaeans, well, then I've got this one. And that's way far away, and the Mycenaeans aren't going to get that one. Or if this one gets flooded by one of the global catastrophes we see. So here's my question. Is it possible that it's a twofold question. Is it possible that the kinds of secrets that would be held in vaults all over the place that are intelligence information have nothing to do with things like nuclear warfare and what happened in Vietnam and the Kennedy assassination, but they're things that need to be kept longer? The kind of knowledge that the ancients might want to have preserved, knowledge of an astrological nature, or knowledge that transcends the needs of any given decade or time. And that might be one reason not to simply declassify something like this, like we did the nuclear films. And part two of that question is, could the distribution of fairly similar ancient sites throughout the known world, from Mesoamerica all the way to Egypt and everywhere else, could that represent the intentional distribution of essentially a distributed backup system to protect ancient knowledge of some meta society that decided to use individual societies the way that any one society uses laborers who live in shacks?
All right. All right, I got you. No, it's a good question.
It's far-fetched. It's wild-ass speculation.
I see where you're going. It's a good question. Let's deal with the ancient stuff first, and then deal with the Rockefeller aspect of this of your speculations. The ancient stuff, as I pointed out in Grid of the Gods, is and also in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men. What you have with many of these monolithic structures, the stone circles and so on, they're even finding these things now in the Baltic states. They've a very famous Swedish Atlantis researcher by the name of Olaf Rudbeck, University of Uppsala, back in the 17th century in Sweden, did this enormous study of these types of ruins in Sweden, and his huge book called the Atlanticum was such a classic that even Sir Isaac Newton just doffed his hat and said this is a huge achievement. It really was a huge achievement. But they're finding these things all over the world. So the question is, what are they for? And I've taken the line of the researchers, I forget who they were, that wrote Uriel's Machine. A couple of Freemason researchers made a very convincing case that what these monuments are to reestablish geodetic and astronomically based systems of measure. And why would you need that? Well, you need systems of measure to conduct commerce on a scale that is more than regional. So in other words, if you're going to have traders in central Germany trading with traders in the Massif Central in France, then they both have to have a common system of measures, or measure systems that are very nearly equivalent. And the only way to do this is to base your units of measure on geodetic and astronomical systems, because they're more or less fairly constant over time. So in other words, this is essential. A common geodetic based system of measure is essential to commerce. You can't have commerce without a system of measure. So this is a crucial thing, and I think this is what the ancients were up to. They're trying to preserve a knowledge after a catastrophe and jumpstart it. And the way to do this is to make these things physically difficult to destroy. And you need redundancy, as you've pointed out. You need this happening all over the world. And incidentally, that's pretty much what you see happening all over the world. They're building these enormous monuments, but they're not really religious monuments. They're monuments that are trying to enshrine systems of measure. So that's number one. And that brings us to the Rockefeller business and why they'd be storing documents. I think it is entirely likely, if I'm following your chain of reasoning here, I think it's entirely likely that you would have, particularly in the Cold War mentality that suffuses the American elite establishment after World War II, and particularly, of course, the Rockefellers would be right in the thick of things. I think it's entirely likely that one of the things they're going to try and do is to cache a bunch of documents of long-term knowledge of this sort in case a major catastrophe like a nuclear war or something else happened. So that would make a great deal of sense. They would need physical redundancy of that type of knowledge outside of the Washington, D.C. complex. That's obviously going to be a target for, Soviet nuclear weapons or French nuclear weapons or what have you. They're going to do this as a matter of course. So yeah, I think you're very, very correct here that this is probably what is partly going on. Um, the problem is they would have to secrete these types of information in underground bunkers, and as far as I can tell, the 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 Rockefeller barn is not, it's not a hardened site. Let's be honest here. So you're going to have hardened sites probably underground where all of this information is stored. But yeah, I think something like that is going on. It's very clear to my mind that this is what went on in ancient times, that this is precisely what they were doing. They were trying to jumpstart a global connectivity after a catastrophe, whatever that catastrophe was. We talked about that in the last dialogue.
Well, so part of the argument you made is that one of the most important things that an elite, a powerful elite, would want to preserve
Right.
is the system of attributing wealth, because
Right.
they have wealth. And if you don't have the same system of measure for
Right.
attributing wealth, you no longer have wealth. If somebody
Right.
says, oh, that gold is not the coin of our realm, we deal in beads, and you
Right.
are poor because how many beads do you own, or how many skins do you have?
Right.
It stops things. So if there were an interest in preserving and distributing the preservation of a system of measure, one could argue it's a system that's a financial instrument.
Yes.
And one could argue that the preservation of intelligence data to this day might be partly about preserving an intelligence instrument.
Yes.
A financial instrument.
Yes.
In how you value something. And it made me think about I can't quite put my finger on what I'm thinking, but it made me think about alchemy and how to make gold, because if you were convinced that you needed an ultimate way to create valuation, to have
Right.
a source, a standard of valuation.
Right.
You need to, and you were worried about a global disaster, you would need to look outside the globe. You would need to look into the
Yes.
solar system or beyond for some kind of standard of measure that would survive
Right.
a global disaster. And that, of course, would raise some questions. It would raise questions of, one, what kind of global disaster are we worried about, and why are we worried about it? And number two, who's we? Who is this? A society capable of distributing knowledge throughout the globe in ancient times would be essentially a meta society.
Right.
that lived overarching the other individual societies. And who is that society? And if those things were the case, this is really way out on a limb, speculation built on speculation. But if you go out on that limb for a second, it would almost imply that you would know about your own death. You'd be convinced of your mortality. That'd be your motivation. You'd want to preserve yourself, and you'd want to preserve yourself into successive generations. And so you would do this by, the only reason to do this, what are you going to save yourself an extra 5 or 10 years? You would do this to preserve dynastic wealth that lasts throughout the ages.
Right.
And I can't imagine a Nelson Rockefeller needing a cosmic system of valuing earthly items or attributing wealth to somebody, but maybe that's wrong. Maybe that is the basis of totalitarian and financial authority from then to now. So that's a lot of stuff I just dumped on your lap.
Well, no, it's actually, I can see that a Rockefeller would be interested in these types of speculations because, again, you have a family dynasty that has accumulated capital over 3 generations at least, if not more by now. But back at that time, at least 3 generations, the grandsons of John D. Rockefeller. The interesting thing here that you've brought up goes back to some blogs I wrote about 3 years ago when there was talk about storing on the moon and other celestial bodies, storing as much human knowledge as possible should something happen here on Earth. These were very serious proposals. Even the Vatican got in on this with the idea that they were going to digitize their archives and contribute some of the archives to these off-world let's call them what they are, these off-world halls of records, you know, that we hear about so much in the alternative community with ancient halls of records. I think this is very definitely part of their thinking. The question is, as you pointed out, why? What are they expecting? And I think in terms of the Cold War mentality of people like an Alan Dulles or a John Foster Dulles or Sullivan and Cromwell, the Wall Street banking community, I think in terms of their thinking, they're probably thinking primarily in terms of a global thermonuclear war, but it could be just about anything that they would be concerned with. Asteroid strikes now against the planet are part of the meme that they're operating with now. So yeah, they're going to store a lot of stuff off-site, and I suspect strongly that it's going to be not only metrology issue related things, but it's going to be financial instruments. You know, I'm still a Luddite in this sense, in that I do not trust electronic systems as data storage. I think there's always got to be physical hard copy backup, physical media of exchange, and so on and so forth. And this, to my mind, is the way that the hidden financial system actually operates, much less on electronic transfers and financial clearing, and much more on the actual physical movement of financial instruments. To this day, this is the way the Bank of International Settlements actually operates. So that's a huge clue as to what's going on. But I do think you're absolutely correct. They're going to seek some sort of physical data storage redundancy. And one of the ways to do this is off planet, and that raises all sorts of issues of its own. Now, the other question you asked was, who are this they? Who's this meta society? And I think that it existed, but I think it existed in a way that people really haven't latched onto. Most people tend to think, well, it's a global conspiracy of some sort. No. What it is after a catastrophe, what you would have in various regions of the world are people with the knowledge that the previous system had to be based on a system of commerce that in turn was based on a common system of metrology. And they are going to try to preserve that knowledge, and the way they did it was precisely, I think, the way that the authors of Uriel's Machine argued. They did this by construction of monuments that embodied the actual metrology, the geodetic and astronomical systems that measure and preserve them. And it doesn't mean that there's coordination between these people in region A and region B that might be separated by hundreds of miles, but they're thinking along the same lines. That's really what I'm getting at. There's a program, and I'm using it precisely in terms of information technology and information thinking. There's a program operating in all of these locations that's producing the same thing. So in other words, there is coordination, but the coordination is not secret societies sending secret messages to each other around the world. It's a group of people thinking the same way about what has to be done in such a circumstance. I hope that makes some sort of sense. That's who I think this meta society really is.
Right. So you're not saying it's not, oh, that show that was on TV for the longest time, and was a movie where, the ancient Egyptians come back and they're gods and they're overseeing.
Oh, Stargate? Yeah.
Stargate.
No,
it's not a Stargate
scenario. No, it's not that. No.
Okay.
Now, if there is an extraterrestrial or off-planet factor involved with all of this, and I think a case could be made for it, or at least that you would have to have people in these power elites thinking along these lines. In other words, they're going to brainstorm all sorts of scenarios, and that's going to be one of the things that they're going to consider. But if you factor that into it, and if they're looking at all these ancient texts and thinking, well, we've got genetic cousins out there and they might come back and it might be catastrophic, look what happened before. Yeah, again, it's going to be another rationalization for why they've got to do this, but it's not going to be the sole factor in their thinking. That's the problem.
So let's go back to this notion of meta society, and you're saying there's no overarching meta society. So this goes back to the question I asked about, um, are we thinking about it right with collective versus autocratic societies? So there's a lot of initiatives right now to democratize science, and this is a normal outflow of what we've seen with the rise of social media. We're democratizing journalism, with horrible results, unfortunately, but we're democratizing a lot of things these days. Anybody is a publisher, anybody wants to get involved. So in terms of democratizing science gathering, you've got, of course, the SETI project, which goes back quite a while.
Yep.
Which is using distributed computing technology, which also made me think of the distributed ancient sites. What if it was distributed technology? But
it is. It's an analog technology that you're dealing with. Yeah.
Well, this is what I was contemplating. But there's also a democratizing of the search for ancient sites. So now people are using drones and satellites, and
right.
And any one person can't study the tiny grid maps of every inch of the planet, or even 10 people, and there's not funding for this. So what you do is you outsource this to the crowd. You crowdsource it, and now you get a democratized data gathering of people looking for ancient sites. For archaeological purposes. It's now being used also, it's combined with the stopping of looting of ancient sites. So people are trying to, it's sort of like looking at the Cuban Missile Crisis, and you're like, hey, that looks like a missile over there. People are watching, trying to figure out whether the movement of trucks in and out of an area constitutes the looting of an ancient archaeological site, etc. Right. So all of this data gathering, the scientific stuff, has been democratized. And that parallels neatly what you're talking about with people thinking about the same thing at the same time in different places. That is essentially a democratization of a financial system, of science, of a system of needs. In essence, it's like saying there's nothing new under the sun. We've sort of been through this cyclically before, and there's a natural outflow. There's a next step that people are thinking about. Oh, we've accumulated something. Now how do we protect the thing we've accumulated? Because this is an ephemeral world and things pass away. But I couldn't help but bring this back around to the Rockefeller files and wonder if why would we democratize science, democratize learning, democratize journalism, but not democratize intelligence and intelligence gathering and the things around that? So it occurred to me that one way of doing that is distributing intelligence assets to multiple people, to protect them, to keep them from being stolen and distributed into a WikiLeaks-like scenario, or to have recourse to them after disaster. So again, I can't put my finger on what I'm after, but there seems to be something in common between them and now, and some of the stuff we're seeing in democratizing the core functions of society now, and what may have gone on in ancient times.
Right. I think it's a plausible scenario. I do think that you have a certain democratization of intelligence information already, just by virtue of the fact that you have so much data gathering being done by corporations, Google, Amazon, things like this. The social media have certainly contributed to it. The internet has certainly contributed to it. As for intelligence itself and why the Rockefellers or people like them, it doesn't take much imagination to see that you're going to have similar things being done by major corporations to protect their proprietary patents and so on and so forth. They're going to have redundant sites where these things are distributed. Think of Lockheed Martin, think of Boeing, think of Airbus, Dassault, Mirage, all these big air companies around the world are going to have similar types of things going on. So the Rockefeller thing doesn't really disturb me from that point of view. They're going to do the same thing. They're going to be protecting their own family financial secrets and so on. They're going to have redundant sites. So yeah, it's going to happen. It's an inevitability. The real question is what is the reason for it? Is there something, as you hinted at earlier, is there something they know that they are not necessarily talking to everybody else about? Um, and it has to be something of a rather extraordinary nature, because the Cold War fears, I mean, let's be honest here, Russia's not going to nuke the United States or nuke Europe. They have no intention or uh, desire, or they wouldn't even benefit from trying to do such a thing. So we can put Cold War, thermonuclear war scenarios of that sort out of the picture. They've got to be much more afraid of terrorist groups getting a hold of a nuclear weapon and detonating it. But again, that's while tragic, that's not going to be a globally threatening sort of scenario to them. So they have to have something else in mind. And the only thing I can think of that they might be thinking here is either in terms of catastrophic collisions with asteroids or what have you, invasions from ET. Who knows? I don't know, but I think we have to look at some really extraordinary scenarios rather than the conventional Cold War scenario, and that's what they might have some sort of inkling uh, about that they have not told everybody else. That's my best guess, and it's only a guess because there's no evidence, real hard evidence for it.
Well, I have another guess, and so to preface this, I'll say I ordered my DNA test recently,
Oh
and
dear.
yes, I wanted to unpack a few things about myself, where I came from, who my ancestors were. I got some surprises
Uh-huh.
and disappointments, but I wanted
Oh, I
mostly.
have to hear about this.
I
Come
mostly
on.
wanted the medical
Come
data.
on, don't dangle that out in front of us and not
Well,
comment.
I'm telling you about it. I'm telling you.
Okay.
So, yeah, I thought, well, all right. So, if you want detail, I mean, okay, for me, the medical information was the key thing I wanted. What do I need to worry about? What do I need to prepare and prevent? What is going to kill me if anything's going to do, and how can I resist it and live longer and stuff like that. So, and what are some explanations for just weird things, right? Everybody has some weird things. It's like, Dr. Farrell, why does he wear that hat? There's got to be something in his DNA that sun affects him in a certain way, or he's more
No, it's
susceptible to
because my
rays.
parents made me wear hats when I went to church as a boy, and I got stuck on hats.
Dr. Farrell, it does not explain the fish-like point that it comes to at the top. It looks like a fin up there. If I saw you swimming in that hat, the lifeguards would rush the water. Everybody get out. Oh, there's a brown hat. Anyway,
Jeez.
it's just Dr. Farrell in his swim trunks. No, but the DNA test, so I did it, and anybody that is interested in doing it, I think it's a good deal. I'll provide a link in the member section with the article, the video notes. And just an FYI about this, we used to get a lot more data. So you paid and you got your data, and the FDA stepped in and shut all that down and said, we're not going to let you have all that medical data because we're worried that the way in which it's being presented suggests that you have a certain thing instead of you're more likely to have a certain thing, and you might start treating yourself and acting on it. And this is scientific, but it's not a diagnosis, and so we're going to shut this down. So they stopped it. So in America, you can get less data than you can get in Europe and Canada and other places. It kind of sucks. We're not allowed to know, right? So what I did was I did a lot of research, and I came up with a two-step system. I didn't invent this, but I found some other people doing it. It works. You order your DNA test from one place, and then you take the file, the raw file they give you, which is the sequence DNA, and you upload it to another place that all they do is analyze DNA, but they don't sell you anything. And what they do is they tell you all the medical stuff that the other guys are not allowed to tell you.
Right.
So you get both the ancestry and the medical side. There's a couple of reasons to do it. So yeah, not that anybody cares about. You're insisting for some reason. I guess you think I'm weird, but
yes, I do, and I'm wanting to know.
Says the guy in the pointy fish hat.
Well,
but so I thought I was mostly Cherokee and German, and it turns out that's not right. I have a little bit of sub-Saharan African in me, like 2% or something like that, from back in slave slavery days. I have a little bit of Native American in me from back in frontier days, a very small percent, nothing like what I thought I had, despite the fact that there are distinct Cherokee traits in my mother's side of the family. I just, you know, the soft, long hair. My hair can grow down like Geddy Lee. And I can look like an Indian, on especially horseback when shirtless. But, you know, that's another matter.
Please.
But, but the Kimosabi. Anyway, I won't do it. But I grew up with the Lone Ranger. But the, by the way, Kimosabi means dirty white man in the Wichita tribe, tribal language. So it's kind of funny. But it turns out it's not true, and I'm not even mostly German. Apparently, I've got a lot of German in me, but apparently I'm like 92% British and Irish. I have no idea how that came about because it's more recent than the German. My father has a German name. I understood my great-grandfather or my grandfather to come over here on the boat, and yet apparently before they got here, they were heavily seeded with some British and German in them. And so I found out that information. That was interesting. I found out that I have a little bit more Neanderthal in me than the average person. That might tell you something. I don't know.
Yeah, that's a bingo.
I got a little bit more Neanderthal, but I sometimes walk on my knuckles, Dr. Farrell. It's not,
yes, we know. It's
normal. It's not my arms are that long. What can I do? So, and you know, I got hair on the back of my palms. It keeps it smooth.
Oh, jeez.
But anyway, how else are you going to trim your fingernails? You drag them along the sidewalk. But
well, that's an interesting ancestry, because in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men, I point out the research of Dr. Brian Sykes at the University of Oxford that did the genetic haplogroup typing based on mitochondrial DNA, and there's about 7 mitochondrial females that are at the basis of all European-based populations.
They got around, man.
Well, they got around, but the interesting thing
I think I dated one of those girls once, and
well,
man.
if your DNA typing is showing a heavy influence of British and Welsh and Irish, that's a distinct haplogroup in terms of mitochondrial DNA that comes.
I've got it.
Well, hang on. It comes up into the British Isles from Iberia. There's a heavy mixture of Basque and that sort of influence, and then in turn that group comes through Tuscany and Sicily in southern Italy, and ultimately leads back to a sub-Saharan African thing. So you and I might actually share the same sort of mitochondrial haplogroup, because that whole migration through the Mediterranean up through the Iberian into the British Isles is one of the distinct patterns that geneticists have found. Anyway, I just thought I'd toss that out there.
Well, I know they tell you which haplogroup you're in, but I'll tell you, my back in ancient times, so my people were Vikings. They were up in the Norse and Norwegian area, and so it's like North Germany, the British Isles, Viking lands. I mean, basically all along the northernmost parts of Europe that my people, until later on when they kind of moved down into the areas you're talking about. And then what's the term? The term that you know, we're in the Caucasus. What's the term? It has to do with the people Hitler was seeking for, the ancient
Aryans. Yeah,
essentially. So my people are about as Aryan as it freaking gets, apparently. Right. I'm basically just straight down, nearly, you know, 92% grade A pure D Aryan. And that was a surprise. Yeah. I always wondered why I felt more comfortable goose stepping on a Sunday afternoon than just walking the normal. I never knew. And Poland has always looked attractive to me. You know, soft, cushy, just waiting to be taken. Leave me alone, leave me alone. No, I will take you. You know, it's Poland. No, but I'm kidding. But yeah, apparently I'm really a white boy. And so, yeah, I don't know. But I found that the medical part really helpful. So you take your data, you upload it to the third-party site. They give you this stuff. And, you know, any one thing is not that revealing. But when you've got about 5 different DNA strands that are saying, hey, you are 5 to 50 more times likely to get this disease than the average person. And you've got several others that are like, you've got a deficiency here, and you're probably going to get this same disease. It kind of begins to come together. There's about 3 or 4 things that are likely to kill me.
Mm-hmm.
And fortunately, I can stave off most of it by taking high amounts of certain supplements. And,
Right.
Yeah, like I have a really low amount of folate. So I have a folate deficiency. It causes me all kinds of problems. So the folic acid is
Mm-hmm.
something that is going to make me more sort of even keeled and also keep me alive longer. But yeah, there's even support groups that once you figure out which genetic strand you have, that some people join because they're like, oh man, the genetics say that we're likely to die of this thing. How do we defend ourselves? Because the medical establishment is not going to help us. So
Right.
we're going to get together and trade anecdotal data and see what we can do to resist our propensity to die of this thing.
Right.
I don't want to get too specific, but like I said, for those that are interested, I'll put a link in the member section and to both of the sites that I mentioned. My question is about this, though. The reason I brought up DNA is it strikes me that the most fundamental thing you would want to preserve in a modern environment, if your transhumanism theory is right, might be the original DNA types, a library of original DNA types. And the other thing I thought about is, well, if you go all the way back to where Neanderthals are interbreeding with Homo sapiens, you have variation in the DNA. You have a lot of potential variation in the DNA. And I wonder, I don't mean that ancient man knew about DNA, but ancient man certainly would know that a thing is not of the same tribe as his own. And I wonder if there's any evidence of ancient or modern man attempting to preserve a particular, you would have to say now, racial type, which gets us
Right.
into the borders of racism and makes
Right.
us kind of nervous. We know that Hitler was digging for that stuff, but what about the far ancients, and what about people like the Rockefellers? Is there
I
any
think I absolutely, I think there is both going on. The Rockefellers, as you know, were heavily invested in the eugenics movements back in the 30s, and they were major backers very quietly of the Human Genome Project. So I do think that there is an element of that kind of incipient, innate Eastern establishment sort of eugenic interest. Margaret Sanger and all of those people, we've got to control and curb the rise of non-Caucasian populations through whatever means. The whole Planned Parenthood movement begins out of that attempt. And the problem is, of course, as you are aware, that when you start interbreeding too much, you end up with a genetic pool that actually is not as capable of adapting. So really, eugenics is kind of a self-defeating purpose. But nonetheless, I do think you have interests like the Rockefellers in trying to figure this out. As far as ancient times go, it's always struck me as very weird that when you look at Sumerian Kings List or Egyptian Kings List, things of that nature, it's very clear that there's something going on in terms of trying to preserve a particular genetic type. And it's very interesting that the Egyptians, along with the Jews, of course, trace their lineage not through the male, but through the female. In other words, that's kind of a hint that they may have known at one time and lost the knowledge and simply preserved through tradition, but they may have known at one time about mitochondrial DNA and its importance in determining your genetic type, because that, of course, comes from the mother. So I think there is a little bit of evidence to suggest that this is something that they very precisely were interested in terms of haplogroups and preserving. Let's just call it what it is: preserving dynastic blood types, preserving dynastic gene pools. Um, I think that there is evidence for this because if you compare the ancient stories that seem to suggest a genetic intervention in human evolution from our genetic cousins, as I like to call them. It's very interesting that they state that the female donors to this project were the then existing humans. The male donor was a single donor, and this came from quote unquote the gods. And they used, according to the ancient texts, I think they used 13 or 14 female mothers in this project. And it's very interesting because this closely approximates the research of Brian Sykes at the University of Oxford. Because when you trace all of the genetic haplogroups, they go back to about 13 or 14 females. And it's very, very interesting because you have a little bit of corroboration of the ancient text there. So I do think that the ancients were somehow aware of, maybe not thoroughly and completely, but they were carrying on by tradition. They were carrying on some sort of genetic awareness. Now, my speculation here is this, and it's always been this. The Genome Project itself, particularly the interest of the federal government in this country of getting everybody's DNA and storing it, is precisely that kind of project that you're suggesting is taking place. I've suspected for a very long time that the Genome Project had a hidden purpose, and that was to identify as closely as possible through modern scientific means, to identify those genome types, haplogroups, that the so-called elite, the nobility, and so on and so forth, come from. I've always thought that this is a hidden part of that project. And interestingly enough, there is a bit of evidence to suggest that, in that if you look at certain genetic studies, they are deliberately targeting the elite families of Europe in these studies. In other words, there have been studies done of the Habsburgs. There have been studies done of the Tudors, believe it or not, in England, the Tudor house. So they are deliberately admitting to a certain extent that, yeah, we're focusing on these groups because they have had a long history of intermarrying with other people in their class, in their noble class or their royal class. So I do think that that is something that is going on, although going on very, very quietly. They've done the same thing with the Romanovs in Russia, because again, you have an identifiable family with an identifiable history over several generations of who they've married, where the people's families that they marry into come from, and so on and so forth. So it's ready made for that kind of scientific study. So yeah, I think you're exactly correct. They're going to want to preserve DNA, and I've strongly suspected, Daniel, and I know this is going to sound wild and crazy, but I've strongly suspected for quite some time that the story of Noah's Ark or Gilgamesh's Ark, or whatever story you're looking at the time, is a story about that. We can forget the idea of a big boat with all sorts of animals going on this boat the way that's presented in Sunday school. I think what you're really dealing with there are genetic samples of things, which makes a lot more sense if you're dealing with a technologically sophisticated society facing some sort of catastrophic event, and they want to preserve everything. So yeah, you've got an ark, but the ark would consist of the actual genetic samples of things. You would need basically nothing more than a petri dish and a culture. And with genetic techniques, you can bring these species back to life. So yeah, I think there's a great deal to be said for your scenario.
Well, yeah, so I've always, by the way, the first gene sequencing occurred in the 70s, in the early 70s. Right. So there's a potential, who knows what's in those files. Could be UFO, could be gene sequencing, could be financial and solar measures. It could be just,
all of the above.
The hidden offspring of the Rockefeller family that nobody wants to know about. It could be anything, but
well, let's go a step further, and I'm going to crawl way out onto the twig here and mention a scenario I've suspected for quite some time. If you research the actual history of the discovery of the untangling of the double helix, Watson and Crick, and so on. There is a key lady here that is involved that very seldom gets mentioned. I forget what her name is, but you can read up about her, because what she discovered using an electron microscope was she took the first pictures of the genome using electron microscopes. And this was years in advance of Watson and Crick. And incidentally, this is coming out of Germany, because prior to the Second World War, the Germans did develop electron microscopy to a very high state. So to my mind, there's probably a hidden history of the double helix itself. The technology, what I'm suggesting is the double helix may have been known as a closely held secret for some time before the actual public announcement of the discovery, by perhaps as much as a decade. So in other words, if you take 1947, when Watson and Crick announced their discovery, push it back 10 years into 1937, and you have a very, very different picture emerging. And that would, incidentally, if that's the case, that would rationalize why you have inside of Nazi Germany, why you have all of these programs to develop, a more pure race with some of the hideous medical experiments the Nazis, Mengele and Strughold and people like that were doing. In other words, I'm suggesting they may have had a technological base for some of these things that they were doing that no one has yet uncovered or suggested.
Well, that's like trying to sort out how you get genetically Brezhnev's eyebrows. And what the hell lives in there?
Caterpillar.
It's like, one of the things you find out when you do a DNA test and you run the medical side is, how likely am I to have monobrow? It's a humbling experience. But well, I always wanted to ask you about this. So it's an interesting comment, and I don't know if I came up with this or if I saw this somewhere, but as far as I know, I thought of it, so I could be wrong. But there's an interesting comment in the Christian scriptures, which says, it's in referring to Christ, he made of one blood all the nations of the world. Mm-hmm. And I can't help when I think of that, but relate it back to the genealogies and right. That are in, because there's no, from a modern literary standpoint, there's no earthly reason to include those genealogies at the start of a couple of the Gospels.
Right.
It's boring reading. All the begats are really just annoying. But when you think about that statement, it's kind of a genetic statement. It's like saying that the physical relationship of the different parties is relevant, and that there's more ancient knowledge of this than meets the eye. Now, one could argue this is really simple. You write down who all the fathers were and you track that, and you needed to know who your fathers were. Your name is based on your father, and who you are in society is based on your father, and everything else. So it's pretty easy to track. And so you just recover all of this information, et cetera. You don't have to know anything about genetics. But it still is an interesting comment. And I wonder if you think that ancient Greek, it was the Greeks who wrote the New Testament. If ancient Greeks, not ancient Greeks, but Greeks of this time, if the beginning right. of the ancient era, beginning of the new, if they had a more developed understanding of genetics than we think they do.
I strongly suspect that they did. You have references in the Old Testament to animal husbandry and breeding certain specific traits into animals. So this has been going on for a long time. People have known about it. They may not have known about the double helix in the genome per se, but they have known about hereditary traits and how to breed them in or out of various species of animals. And they certainly would have noticed, hereditary traits in human populations. So it's a very interesting thing that in the Middle East you do, and for that matter in India, you do see this concentration on making sure that your family is bred into the right uh, genetic lines. The problem I would caution people against is there is a certain strand of fundamentalism in the United States, especially, that wants to view Christ as a genetically pure line, having no admixture with the giants and so on and so forth in the Old Testament, and they actually use this as a rationale for explaining some of the, let's be honest here, barbaric behavior of Yahweh in the Old Testament. While he's wiping out a certain impure genetic line in order to preserve the pure genetics for the appearance of Christ. You actually hear this argument in certain circles. And the problem there is if you look at the genealogies in the New Testament, you've got two very different ones in the New Testament. And there's not any claim in those genealogies towards genetic purity. That's the problem. It's more a case of documenting a lineage or heritage that goes back to King David. That's really what the importance there of those genetic begats, as you call them, is there for. But to argue from that to a basis of genetic purity, exceeds the evidence that's available. That's the problem. And the other problem there is a theological one, if I can address that very briefly. With all the intermarriage going on, particularly with the idea that the modern human genome is not simply confined to Homo sapiens sapiens. We've got Neanderthal genes mixed up with us. The theological point is that Christ making one blood of all people, what that really is saying is that his life, death, resurrection, and so on is meant to affect all people. There's no suggestion here of a genetic purity in Christ, that his human nature is only confined to the genetically pure. In fact, that would be kind of a genetic version of Calvinistic limited atonement, which is not part of early Christian doctrine at all. So I would make those cautions to people that they have to be very, very careful when they start getting into genetics and the begats of the New Testament and so on, because they can be twisted and used, and have been twisted and used by certain people driving certain types of agendas and apologetics. And I've always found that particular kind of apologetics, and it's coming out of a very Calvinistic wing of American evangelicalism, which again says something in itself right there. So I would caution people against that.
Well, so I want to pivot a little bit and ask you about something else that's happened recently. And that is the strange assassination of the Korean leader's, the rather exotic assassination of the Korean leader's brother.
Yeah, that's weird.
Yeah, so, the latest that I've read is, there may be more recent, but the most recent I've read says that VX nerve gas is right, the accused culprit. And originally people said, well, that wouldn't happen because it would kill the people applying it, and it would kill a lot of people around you.
Right.
It's a weapon of mass destruction. And but then some, I think, American scientists said, no, not actually. If you used a binary form of it, you'd have a precursor, and then you'd have something that completes it. And either one would could be carried around and applied with very little risk, and there would be a delayed reaction and so on.
Right.
And so, the story is that a woman runs up and rubs a cloth on his face, and then another woman runs up when she leaves and rubs a cloth on his face, and then he begins staggering toward the counter in pain, basically saying it burns, it hurts, etc. Horrible thing to do to a human being. And this guy, by all accounts, is a very innocent person, other
Right.
than essentially being born into a family that is profiting off the backs of everybody. But in terms of being a tyrant, maybe he would have been, but he's not hurting anybody. He's been hiding out most of his life,
Right.
and been hunted. So they apparently get word of his itinerary and they take him out. And all signs point to the North Korean dictator for doing this. It's not even, I think, really a question. But I couldn't help but notice this is a rather exotic assassination. It reminds me of the isotope that was used to kill one of Putin's enemies at one point.
Right.
It's a signature hit. You don't. It's not like, oh, he was shot or stabbed or poisoned with arsenic or cyanide.
Right.
This is some exotic stuff. When you do this, the you're you're either trying to put your signature on it, or you're trying to scare the heck out of people. This is what happens to our enemies, almost like you're sending a message. And in that sense, it's rather mafia-like.
Yes. Borgias.
Yeah, so I couldn't help but think of a couple of questions. One of which is, well, first, I'd like to know what you think about this, but also I'd like to this whole scenario and the use of VX nerve gas. Secondly, if that's in fact what it was, why do something like that versus something much simpler? A syringe of something
Right.
that takes about 30 seconds or something. And two, given that this is rather mafia-like behavior, do we think that countries like North Korea and like Russia are essentially the new mafia in some way that we haven't really discussed, in the way that whole cities and, if you will, ancient city-states were more like countries. Whole Italian cities were essentially mafia towns,
Right.
in the sense they were run by powerful families who
Right.
had resources to wield the equivalent in those days of weapons of mass destruction, like the plague. So my question is, why this exoticism in assassination, and what do you think of it?
Well, I think first of all, your scenario is correct. I think it's an exotic method of getting rid of somebody. It's a method designed to send a message that, and the message is really very diabolical, because it's really saying you cannot trust any source of your food supply, your liquid supply, because we could be introducing precursors into that supply that we can apply the binary second component at a much later date through another means of delivery. So the intention here is to produce fear in the general population, be it in North Korea, be it in the rest of the world. It's designed to send a clear message that they have the means of delivery, and to make everybody think twice about doing something. So I'm in agreement with you there. This is what struck me as well about this guy. And I the only thing that I would perhaps differ with you is that I am not convinced that this would have to be coming as a hit from the North Korean dictator. It could equally be a message being sent to him rather than from him. And any power with the intelligence apparatus to deliver a binary poison like that could be behind sending the message. It could be the communist Chinese, it could be the Taiwanese, it could be the Japanese, it could be America, it could be anybody with the means to do this, sending a message. I think we have to hold open both possibilities. It's either a message from the North Korean dictator or to him. And if it's to him, especially given their recent actions with the missile tests over Japan and so on, I think it's as likely to be a message to him as from him. But the second part of your question, mafia-like behavior, I am not convinced at all that Russia is engaged in these type of activities on a massive scale. If anything, I am much more convinced that some sort of mafia-like war is being waged against the Putin government rather than by it. We've seen too many deaths of Russian diplomats, Russian leaders, and so on in recent days and weeks. And I'm fully convinced this is some sort of covert war being waged by the West through cutouts, probably, against Russia than anything else. I am willing to say that if that is the case and if it continues, we can expect fully some sort of Russian retaliation of a similar nature. I keep telling people covert operations are a game that two people can play. The Russians have been playing that game for a very, very long time, and they know how to do it. I strongly suspect, in that regard, that some of the things that we've seen happening in um, in California, particularly with the attacks against internet connections in the San Francisco Bay Area, the attack a few years ago, I think it's 3 or 4 years ago, against the electrical substation at the very southern end of the Silicon Valley. In fact, I know exactly where that substation is. I've been by it many times on the highway. That was a very professional hit, as were the internet strikes in the Bay Area. It appears to me, and I would not write off the Russians in this respect, that they are testing or trying to reconnoiter the soft targets for internet connections. It could be equally the Chinese, we don't know. But somebody is clearly reconnoitering the internet, particularly in the West, to try and target its soft areas. So I do think that there's some sort of covert war going on right now between the West, probably through cutouts, and that bloc that has aligned itself with Russia. Most recently, it's very interesting you asked this question, because I just read an article today before the show started that President Erdogan in Turkey has now come out and directly accused Germany as having been involved in the coup attempt against him. Now, take that for whatever it's worth, because Erdogan is as much of a psychopath and liar as anybody else in that region of the world. However, the Turkish intelligence services are very, very good, and this may indeed be the case, and it would stand to reason that Germany might attempt to do something like that, because Merkel's disastrous refugee policies have made her very unpopular in the country, and she's attempting to maintain face while at the same time trying to negotiate Turkey out of sending more and more refugees into Europe. So the Germans might have been tempted to do some sort of covert operation against the Erdogan government. So I do think, if you look at the picture worldwide, I do think you're looking at kind of a full-scale, as you've suggested, mafia war of some sort taking place. There's no doubt in my mind that is true.
Well, I know this is controversial, so
yes,
I will know what I'm about to ask, but I will still kick the question out there and let the chips fall where they may. What do you make of Michael Flynn and Jeff Sessions having met clearly and demonstrably with Russian intelligence assets during the Trump campaign, and this is all coming out? And if two were caught, maybe there's six that weren't. I don't know, but what's striking about it is if it's innocent, you don't really lie about it, but then you lie about it, you get caught. One of you gets fired, and the other one another one of you recuses yourself. I think it would challenge reason to say that nothing's going on, that there's not something at the root of this, that this is all perfectly innocent, casual meetings of no import and not relevant to anything that's occurring on the geopolitical and the domestic political stage. So my question is, I wasn't thinking about Russia until I saw the Korean assassination. I was like, wow, that really reminds me of Putin. And then I got to thinking about the recent Russian or the current Russian thing that's still being investigated. Any thoughts on what's at
Well,
root?
as far as Flynn and Sessions go, I have to be honest. I think this is the radical left making a tempest in a teapot. It's entirely natural for someone in their position, particularly Flynn's position, to have contact with foreign leaders and talk with them prior to the assumption of a new administration into office. I really don't see the big deal. However, that said, I question why, if they're making the big stink over Flynn, why they didn't make as big of a stink, if not bigger stink, over Hillary Clinton selling all the uranium to Russia. What is behind that? That is clearly an egregious violation, in my opinion, of national security. Similar comments, could be made about Bill Clinton and the negotiation of technology transfers to communist China. So if we're going to point fingers at the Trump administration, I think we have to point four fingers right back at the left. My problem with Flynn and my problem with talking with the Russians is I think that the game here is much, much deeper than the lamestream American media wants to admit. I believe that there is a segment within the American military industrial complex that is deliberately trying to demonize Russia to set us back into a Cold War mentality. President Putin himself has said this and stated this. And in Russia, there is now official investigation of American media with respect to these things. I think that, if anything, what Flynn and that group may have been trying to do is head off another confrontation with Russia that could be disastrous. So I think there's a much deeper geopolitical game being played. Now, would the Russians have reason to take out the brother of the North Korean dictator? I think the answer clearly there is yes, because North Korea is in every classical sense that I can think of a rogue state. And the Russians would not, particularly with their recent deals with Prime Minister Abe in Japan, the Russians would not want to see any destabilization in that region that can upset what they've just accomplished in their negotiations with Mr. Abe. They've got their hands now on a lot of Japanese capital to try and develop the infrastructure in Siberia, and they need Japan as a counterbalance to the growing influence of China in Siberia. So I think the Russians would have, clear geopolitical reasons to send messages to the nutcase in Pyongyang. And the Japanese, the other factor here that's got to be, I think, considered in terms of Russians' calculations of the strategic calculations in the Far East, I think they have to be equally concerned that Japan would rearm, perhaps even, Japan has long been thought to have a nuclear capability that all they need is a screwdriver turn in order, to make it a real thing. This has been bandied about for years and years. Japan is very much like Germany in this respect. They are de facto nuclear power. They've probably got all the parts for nuclear and thermonuclear weapons. All they need to do is assemble them, so to speak. So Russia, I think, has very clear reason to try to offset any potential Japanese rearmament. They would view North Korea as a very destabilizing influence. So I think you're correct there that Russia may have been involved in this. But again, it goes back to my original scenario. If Russia's involved, then they're sending messages to North Korea rather than to the West from North Korea. So yeah, it's a very complex calculus. I do think that in terms of relationships with Russia, the Trump administration is in a very, very difficult position because, on the one hand, they've got to have contact with Russia. I'm not at all upset that Flynn had contact with the Russian ambassador. Not at all. What I do think that presages is they are in a very, very combative situation vis-a-vis elements of the American deep state on the one hand that would like nothing more than to see us return to a Cold War mentality. And frankly, I don't see that that's necessary. I think Russia could be and should be a major partner with the United States. We don't really have conflicting geopolitical interests other than in Iran. So I can't, I've looked at this whole demonization of Russia thing, Daniel, I'm just, to this day, it boggles my mind that we keep pushing Russia away uh, after numerous attempts by the Putin regime to try and correct the situation. He's made this very, very clear. So, I'm not saying the guy's a nice guy, but on the other hand, if you read accounts of Americans who knew him during the Soviet era in Leningrad, they to a man and sometimes a woman will tell you that he was one of the few Soviet officials that was absolutely incorruptible in terms of taking bribes or things like that. So, make of that what you will.